When we draw like these system architecture diagrams of what a system is going to do, there's boxes that represent function. And I think in the same way, the data layer kind of sits on top of infrastructure. When we talk about, we want to have connectivity between data. I think AI will eventually evolve to another abstraction that sits on top of the data layer. And so now when we're building systems, we're not building individual components that just do one thing.
This is All Quiet on the Second Front, a podcast where boring conversations around defense tech and national security come to die. Join me, Tyler Sweatt, and my Second Front comrades as we dismantle the mundane, cut through the bureaucratic BS to demystify the world of defense tech. But be warned, this is not a typical government podcast. Ready to get weird? What's up, everybody? I'm your host, Tyler Sweatt. Welcome to another episode of All Quiet on the Second Front, the podcast where boring defense talk comes to die. Pretty excited to be cracking the shell on a longtime listener, first-time caller, near and dear friend, Mr. Bryan Lane. So thanks for coming by, brother.
Thanks a lot, Tyler. I really appreciate it. I've been like flagging you down in the halls. When can I get on the podcast? So yeah, I'm definitely very happy to be here today.
Proof that dreams do come true.
That's right. That's right. And I've been seeing a lot too. You can always shoot your shot, right? And just say like, cold LinkedIn message. Hey, when can I get on the podcast?
We're Twitter DMing for a minute there.
On the late Friday night.
Yep. Heck yeah, man. Well, cool. Let's level set a little bit. Give folks the kind of who are you. You've got an exceptionally interesting journey and set of, I think, really unique experiences. So let's walk through some of background, kind of who you are, what you're working on now, and what's got you excited as we kind of look forward.
Yeah. Okay. So I joined the Marine Corps. I was active duty Marines from 2003 to 2008. I was an Arabic linguist, and I spent 2006 to 2007 in sunny Fallujah. And when I got out of the Marine Corps, I made a very confident decision that I want to do anything other than translate Arabic. I was sitting with headphones on my head for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and then going out and, doing the SIG and stuff over there. And so when I left active duty, I joined the Joint IED Defeat Organization, and I think that's where we overlapped. I worked in the acquisition side for about a year, and then I transitioned over to the COIC, and that was kind of my early exposure to, back then it was Web 2.0 and big data analytics, and now everything is all Gen AI.
Yeah, that was one of the OG spots back in the day.
Yeah, that's for sure. I did the COIC thing. We started to build out multi-int fusion and how to pull together data from all these different sources and understand what kind of impact that data has on the battlefield, and do planning around convoy operations and route clearance patrols and things like that. And this is actually a complex problem. This is not a complicated problem, right? Complicated problem has a lot of variables, but complex problems have a lot of variables and unpredictability. And so it was very, very fascinating. I left the COIC. I went to IBM, where I supported the Pentagon doing their counter-IED technology evaluation and assessments. Spent a little bit of time in industry working in geospatial, very, very hardcore industrial strength imagery software. And then spent a little bit of time at Director of National Intelligence. And then I crossed over into federal service in 2019. Shortly after the Joint AI the DoD Joint AI Center stood up. When I joined GSA, I thought I was getting away from DoD and national security, but as soon as they saw it was on my resume, they were like, "Oh, we've got some partners for you." Yep. And so they pulled me in to work with the Jake, and that's where I met some of our other dear friends like Jackie Tame and others. And then in 2021, I left GSA and I joined the FDIC. And so I'm there now as the Assistant Director for Business Intelligence.
It's awesome. And I think the uniqueness of sort of serving in sort of these major named operational environments and then being on sort of, love it or hate what COIC was or is remembered as, It was pretty cutting edge for a chunk there, and it was flying below the radar. So you were able to push the envelope on a lot of really interesting experimentation that had a direct sort of tangible correlation to output and outcome. But then able to move from that into some of the more macro policy big. That is just an interesting juxtaposition that I don't think a lot of folks get.
Yeah.
And then sort of tying a bow on that and coming over to FDIC. Right, there's a few. I'm framing it like that because there's a few places I want to go. It's a super interesting conversation. I want to start with kind of the GIDO COIC and a single anecdote, but I think one that gets talked about a lot and is usually, I think, contextualized differently based on maybe where you're sitting or your position on an argument. All of the talk right now is around needing to sort of like relearn or learn, hey, you know, the DOD or the government has to be able to innovate faster, has to be able to buy faster. Like, we better go solve this huge intractable problem. And, you know, I've said it before. I've said it to Jackie and a few others. Like, hey, we kind of solved this in the 2000s. We like institutionalized with MRAP, you know, we institutionalized that solution with GIDO and JCamp and, you know, COIC from an enabling thing and all of that. And then we killed it. and you know, shoved it into ditch run. We're like, here, you should live here.
Yeah.
So walk me through kind of as we think about the MRAP story and what that is or isn't. You know, where do you sit at being someone who was there for most of it?
Yeah. Oh, I love this, and I could spend a whole hour talking about this, right? But so let me put some context first. When I joined GIDO, it was 2008, and it was like right shortly after the MRAP transition from GIDO to like an Army program of record, right? And so from a GIDO perspective, they were like, we're out of the MRAP business, but we learned some lessons along the way. And so those lessons then bled over into the ground-based jammer programs and directed energy systems and everything from bomb sniffing dogs to, you know, airborne platforms that find roadside bombs. Like, it was really like a very interesting acquisition environment to be in. And my beef, I guess, with the recent calls to, you know, this return to the age of the MRAP is, I think on the acquisition side, it wasn't as clean as we would like to romanticize as it is today.
Yeah. Little rose-colored lens looking back. Right? It was chaos at the time.
Yeah, it was chaos at the time. But, you know, 20 years ago, it was not so bad. And so, like the first thing is, we live in a very different environment than 2003 to 2010, like that window. That's a very important like frame of context window for me, because that was my active duty military time, and then my time at GIDO working these different counter IED systems. And I think the era of like this age of the MRAP mantra was different. We had some things back then that we don't have today. I think there were some unique differentiators for GIDO as an organization, right? The DepSecDef direct line of reporting, 3-year colorless money, which is really nice. But the other thing that we had was a national unity around what we were trying to do. Yeah. And it was on the news every day. And what we were trying to do was keep the casualty count down, keep the number from going up. And it was reported, you know, on every news network. It was in the bottom banner of every single screen on TV. How many IED casualties for the day? And so from a legislative branch perspective, everybody was on board. From an executive agency branch, everyone was on board. And there were signals to indicate that. Memos from the SecDef and the DepSecDef, you know, national strategy, things like that. And from a public perspective, it was, you know, we had gone through this phase of, you know, post 9/11, and then are there WMDs? And now we're here, and we need to keep Americans and civilians safe. And so that was like a mission that everybody could get behind. Yeah. And we had the funding and we had the acquisition innovation to do it. And I think where we're at today is different. And the reason I think it's different is I don't think we have that unifying element of like, what are we really trying to do?
Yeah.
And until we have that, it's going to be hard to bring everyone together.
Yeah. I think that sense of unity, that sort of shared vision, we all talk about like the common enemy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is absolutely a challenge right now in terms of velocity and prioritization and how we even think about sort of the prosecution of certain missions.
Mm-hmm.
Flip that for me and talk about that. Is there transferability of like that lack of unity at a national level in terms of common enemy, common problem, common outcome? How does that then start to translate into technology adoption in the government? And, because I think I was yesterday up in New York talking to folks about sort of, artificial intelligence as more of a proxy for emerging tech. I think it's just it's the easiest one right now. Yeah. And like, hey, like, why is it hard or easy or what's going on? I was like, well, there's no real perspective. There's some high level sort of policy. And then at like maybe a practitioner level, I think everybody's got sort of their own guidance. But if you think like agency and department, the same way our procurement process is sort of fractured, it's a feature, a benefit, or a bug, depending on who you are.
Yeah.
I think our technical side is somewhat similar, but I'd be really interested, with the JIC, the GSA, and FDIC, like where are you seeing what's inhibiting, what's accelerating, from an AI standpoint?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, easy questions only here.
Super easy question. This is like a 3-word answer. So all right. So here's what I'll say. I like acquisition a lot. I know acquisition, you can point to acquisition, you can point to security as kind of like, the villains when you're an industry trying to get inside of government. And I think the challenge with acquisition and technology is knowing today what to buy that will meet the needs of what you have 2 or 5 years from now.
Yeah.
And I think we have done this successfully for a few things. And I'll use like the software factory concept.
Yep.
Right? At some point in time in the government, we made a decision that said, we're not gonna buy an app. We're gonna buy an app factory. And I think with something like Replicator, we said we're not gonna buy a quadcopter. We're gonna buy a quadcopter factory.
Yep.
And we're gonna push it out to the edge and spit out as many as we can.
Yeah.
And I think this starts with acquisition. This starts with understanding, knowing what you need to buy, and it is a lot less prescriptive than what you think.
Yeah.
And that's also how I think about artificial intelligence. This is the first year. So I've been doing these, executive education workshops on artificial intelligence. And for, I would say about 3 years, all we did was talk about risk,
Yep.
right? We talked about, existential risk, the singularity event, the Skynet scenario. We talked about systemic risk, which is, undetected bias in systems that cause harm. And then we talk about, this kind of whack-a-mole general IT system risk where something doesn't do what you want it to do.
Yeah.
Right. And this is the first year where I'm in these executive briefings and somebody raises their hand and says, hey, can we skip talking about Skynet and, and systemic harms and get to the part where we talk about ATO and like what an implementation plan looks like.
How to make this real.
Yeah. And so I think we finally turned a corner there. And maybe we can get some lessons learned for other kinds of emerging technology because everyone is so hyper-focused on AI right now. But I think, I think from a procurement perspective, it's about risk management.
Yeah.
And, when you enter into a contract, you like set that timeline of like, I'm accepting this risk for these capabilities for this amount of time. I think we're learning a lot on AI. I think we've gotten past many of the risks and harms, and now it's like, how is AI really changing the game across all mission spaces?
Are you seeing You talk about sort of like the factory model, and I think that is a good way to think about sort of like investing in scale and extensibility versus like an elegantly perfected widget. Are you seeing that translate to outcome, and are you seeing that sort of maybe simplify? Because I think the hope on the other side would be, hey, if I'm, and I don't mean this like in a pejorative, it's the only way I can, if I'm taking sort of like an industrial model where I'm scaling kind of a vertical integration on like how a thing is going to be done, I think the assumption is that works because there are clearly defined processes, there are clearly defined owners. And then I look at like artificial intelligence, or I go back to the ATO problem, and I think it's the opposite. Of there isn't clearly defined owners. And I can't tell if, and I agree with the sentiment, right? Like the acquisition folks, they just get thrown under the bus. Like same as AOs.
Yeah.
Jobs I would never want to have. But are we even setting the field correctly to take advantage of either industrial sort of approaches where we can scale and have opinionation, or, policy agility? Like if DepSecDef in January was like, hey, you've got 3-year colorless money for AI, how would we even prosecute that? It feels so fractured right now.
Yeah. I think, all right, so I talked to my engineering teams a lot about this, and I for one, I do not think that chat is the killer app for AI. I don't think that, multimodal user interfaces are the killer app. What I believe is, when we draw like these system architecture diagrams of what a system is going to do, there's boxes that represent functions.
Yeah.
Here's your transmitter, here's your receiver, here's this, here's that, whatever. And I think in the same way, the data layer kind of sits on top of infrastructure. When we talk about, we want to have connectivity between data, I think AI will eventually evolve to another abstraction that sits on top of the data layer. And so now when we're building systems, we're not building, individual components that just do one thing. And I think AI will bring this about in terms of agents and having agentic components within systems. Yeah. So now you have one layer of abstraction. Instead of just handling like one set of instructions, you have a component that can handle an array of instructions, and then make these kind of orchestration decisions about what to do. And then you have multiple agents working together. I think that's what the future can be. I think some agencies are closer to that than others. I think commercial industry is gonna blow government out of the water in terms of how fast they advance. I'm seeing AI first companies today that are their high level components are pure generative AI modules that pass information back and forth and generate like very intelligent things that you can't do with a simple service. So I think that's the future. I think we've got a long way to get there. And I think industry really is primed to help the government with that.
So then taking it from there, talk to me about sort of like the FDIC is the interesting sort of stop on your path. I said it when you did it though, like economic security is national security.
Sure.
Right? Like there's a huge aspect of that is wildly critical to the foundation upon which we will build the future of sort of democracy in America and that. So what's that been like, and how are you guys looking at, emerging tech or commercial tech? How are you guys thinking about that relationship there?
Yeah. I'll say a few things that are public, and I want to tell a short story if we have time.
We always have time for short stories.
All right, great. Yeah. So when I made this decision, I kind of had a fork in the road from a career perspective, and it was like, should I go, be a part of the DoD AI movement? National security and has been a part of my career, since I joined the Marine Corps, since I stood on the yellow footprints.
That's right.
Right. And I really had a struggle in terms of personal and professional identity to go over to the FDIC, which at the time I was thinking, well, like this is not really in my wheelhouse. And a dear friend of mine said, financial and economic security is national security. And when you think about, the organization and the feature that the organization provides, not every country in the world has that feature.
That's right.
To provide safety for bank depositors and safety for our financial institutions. And so once, it was Jackie Taman. So once Jackie said that to me, then it clicked. And I was like, oh yeah, this is a holistic problem. If we're going to continue to be, to be the greatest country on earth, like all organizations have to level up in these areas. And so what is interesting to me, not just about FDIC, but about, many of the government agencies is everything happens through the stroke of a pen. Yeah. And I found this out, during COVID. We were supporting the COVID task force at DOD. We were doing work on, the pandemic response. Yep. And I went out and I interviewed a bunch of chief data officers from executive agencies. And I said, how are you using data to solve this issue? And every single one of them started off with, I received guidance from OMB. I wrote a new policy that did X. So we talked to NOAA and they said, we had to shut down our on the ground inspection sites for fisheries. So we had no ground truth observers for 6 months or 3 months or whatever it was. I talked to State Department. They said, well, we have embassies all over the world and every country has a different policy. So we had to write a policy for, that was general enough to support all of them. And then they had to write their own policies. And so what I think we're just scratching the surface of is all of these actions happen through the stroke of a pen, and we are really nowhere near understanding what those impacts are, what the effects are as it happens. And we have the technology to do it today.
Yes, we do.
And that's what I get really excited about. And I think I think about policy as like the configuration files for our government. Yeah. Right. And for our country and for our nation.
Code.
Policy is code, right? Yeah. A new law comes out and that propagates across the whole nation, all the way down federal, state, local government level to individual communities. And, I really think there's tremendous good that can be done there with understanding that better and building, a technology ecosystem that supports pulling out those insights. And I think using AI is one way to do it.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting to think about sort of the dissemination and like surface area configuration for policy intent and implementation. I also think it would allow you to sort of federate local policy, exemptions sounds like a broad word, but like just variance.
Sure.
While not decoupling it from original intent. Because I think the problem you have now is, if I'm CIO X or CTO Y and I, verily send out this policy, and if every agency has like some of their own interpretation of it, at some level of sort of federation, it's no longer that policy.
Sure.
It's also increasingly likely that there's fratricide.
Yeah.
In implementation.
Oh, and even better, it's going to change over time.
Yeah.
Too.
So we're talking V0 right now.
Yeah, right. So here's a great example. And I'll go back to the global war on terror really quickly. So there was a time where we had changed the rules of engagement for special operations. During the global war on terror, we pushed decision authority down. And we did that for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. We did some operations. Maybe in some cases we overreached, and that's for DOD, IG to figure out, and others. But then after you have a period of time with kind of this corpus of operations and outcomes and court cases and all of these different things, then they say, whoa, well, maybe we need to scale back some of this and do more of this. And I think there's a lot of really well-meaning policies that are put out, and then we don't do the follow-up and say, 2 years has gone by. How is this? Did we get the outcome that we want? we also have a responsibility on, civil liberties and privacy and to be, good stewards of the public interest. And those things are always under continuous evaluation.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting ways I'd heard somebody explain this to me, where, maybe they gave it as a parallel, was if you think about, like an OT sort of network, or what's on a broader network, what boxes are on it, what terminals are on it. Everybody focuses on the new thing. And hey, here's how we support, here's how we secure, here's our update cycles for the new thing. But you go back to like 4 iterations ago, and there's all these dormant boxes that are just sitting on a network.
Yeah.
And like, that's the risk surface, right? That's an attack vector.
Yeah.
When we think about policy and how we architect it and then how it is implemented, if we've got dormant sort of unsupported policy that still hasn't been rescinded, it's still floating around.
Yeah.
We've now sort of enabled this like massive fratricide to occur in implementation, and we've just opened ourselves up to execution risk.
Yeah. And there's, there's a lot of pruning that goes along with that. One other thing I'll say is, so in one of my other roles, I did, and this will go back to acquisition. We did studies on major IT programs focused on automation. So it was like, we're going to automate this very significant portion of our tech stack. And when I say big programs, I mean, they're ranging from 150 to $750 million, right? And our goal was to figure out all of the lessons learned from these acquisition efforts, right? So we started with, what was the requirement? What was the statement of work? Who was the vendor? What was the performance, right? And many of these got canceled. Yep. This is like 2008 to 2015 time range we're looking at. And as these things got canceled, what we realized is, all right, you make a $200 million investment to automate X. And we say like, oh, no, that's not it. But there's a part of X that sticks around and is actually valuable.
Yeah.
And then over a 10-year period, then you look and you say, well, we added X, X survived this cancellation, Y survived this cancellation, Z survived this cancellation. And now we combine those 3 things together and we have an automated system. And so it's like, you don't think about innovation on the scale of 10 years, but with these big and very, very complex efforts, that's kind of the atomic unit of measurement. It's 10 years of trial and error to get to, what you think the future state is. And then that can then be broken down into the micro level of what's happening on the individual sprint teams and this. But the final point here is all of that goes back to the stroke of a pen. Somebody wrote the requirement. Someone wrote the acquisition package. Someone wrote the cancellation memo.
Yep.
And then years later, you go back and you start to dig through all of this history, and you realize, there's nothing new under the sun. Yeah. We've done this before. It's the age of the MRAP all over again. Yep. And we have opportunities to take those lessons learned and drive into the future.
Yeah. And that's a perfect segue, right? So the last question we always ask folks is, pretty much the one structured question we'll ever ask on the show is, you're king for a day.
Yeah.
And you can sort of wave a wand and, whatever you want to be will be. You don't have to caveat. There's no dependencies. And I think, we've talked everything here from tech adoption to implementation of policy to interoperability sort of organizationally and procurements to security. There's so many different ways to go here. So I'm super curious, not to hype up the pressure on the answer here. No, I'm real curious.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a good question. I'm realizing now that most of the challenges that we have are people-centric. Yeah. We can talk process and technology all day, and process is always busted, we're always behind in technology. But I really, every hard problem that I have ever solved has been when people, even with people with opposing interests or incentives, when they can find a way to come together and get stuff done.
Yeah.
And so if I could change one thing for a day, I would change the pay scale.
Yeah.
I would change the pay scale, and I would open up, it's crazy. Netflix engineers are making $1 million a year. Yeah. And I think there are a lot of very talented engineers that are patriots that want to serve America, and they look at the pay scale and they go, I'm not taking a $500,000 pay cut to work on a 10-year-old application.
That's right.
And it doesn't have to be hiring though, right? I think that I think there's plenty of innovation that we can do around bringing people into government. Of course, GSA, they have the PIF program, and they have the Centers of Excellence and 18F and things like that. I think there's a tremendous amount that we can do in bringing very talented engineers into government for a short period of time to do a term of service.
Yeah, just talked to Mike McGinley about this.
Yeah,
some of the Gig Eagle stuff on trying to turn that into how do we harness, maybe even in like micro doses, some like tier 1, top tier technology sort of expertise, or anything technology in this example. Bring it in real quick to just help sort of flatten some of the curves we're going through.
Sure. And we can do this. I really love the what is it called? The IPA program. Yeah. So you can use the IPA program to bring expert researchers into your environment. You can also bring in artists. You can literally you can literally bring in artists to like do art for your organization. Yeah. And I think there's
the old DIA comic books.
Yeah, right. How cool would that be? Build DIA comic books and then give them to kids and like show kids like what service to the nation looks like. Yep. I love stuff like that. And so again, same thing with acquisition. I think there's plenty of latitude to innovate there. I think the paycheck is a big driver for a lot of people that want to do service but can't. We got
to free up those resources so we can be competitive in the age of talent wars.
That's right. That's right. Especially now that people can make the same or more money from home.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so
work on a 10-year-old problem in a 100-year-old building.
That's right.
With 50-year-old technology.
That's right. 100%.
For half the cost.
Yeah. Yes, but you get a pension.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. I think it is a theme we've talked about a lot of sort of the unifying both challenge and opportunity is a human layer in many of these problems, and the need to unshackle and to harness sort of the greatness of American ingenuity and innovation and just grit, for lack of a better term, is something that like we in the national security community have to maintain like a staunch fanaticism about. Yeah. To be able to go do. So that rocks.
And then like when you ask your team to do crazy stuff, they're like bought in. They're like, yes,
run through walls for it.
I want to do that. Yeah. Absolutely.
Bunch of Kool-Aid people just running through walls. Dude, this rocks. Yeah. I am so glad we got to do this. And I'm really excited. One, just to have you still in the fight, but two, where you're actually working the mission now.
Yeah.
I think, we talked a little bit about sort of like, economic security is national security. I don't think enough people take that to heart. And I'm super grateful that folks like you were on the stick over there. So thanks for swinging by, brother.
I appreciate it. Thank you again. It was great talking to you, Tyler.
Heck yeah.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.